Okay, so I guess it's 9 o'clock and maybe we can begin. Okay.
That sounds great.
Okay, great. So welcome everybody to the session, which is called Tradition versus Modernity, Transforming Places. My name is Tanu Sankalia. I'm a professor in the Department of Art and Architecture at the University of San Francisco, and I'm going to be your session chair for today. So we have four really interesting papers, and what I'm going to do is introduce each speaker, and then you'll speak for about 20 minutes, and then I'll introduce the next speaker, and then they will speak for 20 minutes. About 5 minutes before, I will write in the chat that you have 5 minutes left, so try and look at that, or I'll at least send a hand signal or try and change the background on my screen to a different color. So let's try and keep it at 20 minutes. And maybe if you start going over 20 minutes, I can even start muting you. But anyway, so hope that's not too difficult. And looking forward to a really interesting session here this morning and this whatever time zone you're in across the world. So let's begin with Dr. Nagwa Sharif. She's going to present a paper titled Nostalgia Against Evolving Forms of Tradition and Heritage, the Case of Nubian Culture. Dr. Nagwa Sharif is a professor of architecture at the Department of Architecture, School of Sciences and Engineering at the American University in Cairo. Dr. Sharif holds a PhD degree from the University of Montreal, Canada, in 1984 in environmental psychology and aspects related to architecture and urban design. Her research interest is in environmental psychology and architectural design, sociocultural aspects of urban design, and human needs in architecture and interior design. So once again, her paper is titled Nostalgia Against Evolving Forms of Tradition and Heritage, the Case of Nubian Culture. Welcome, Professor Sharif.
Thank you, Tanu. Thank you very much for this introduction. Please allow me to share my screen. Yeah, first of all, I just would like to express that I'm really glad that we finally made it to the conference. Although it's not face to face, although we're not gonna have to enjoy, we're not gonna be enjoying the coffee and donuts as was mentioned this morning. But anyway, we will make the best out of this online form of conferences. So far, I've been attending the previous presentations and activities are very interesting, and it will. I hope it will continue like this. I would like to give you my greetings from Cairo, Egypt. As you were just mentioning, whatever is the timing in the different parts of the world, it's the evening, 6 o'clock in the evening here in Cairo. And as you just mentioned, my name is Nagwa Sharif. I'm a professor of architecture at the American University in Cairo. And today I'm going to talk about the Nubian culture and particularly the nostalgia against evolving forms, tradition, and heritage, which is the case of the Nubian culture. So why Nubia and what is Nubia and why are we studying this part of the world? Because Nubia was actually an ancient African kingdom dating around 6,000 Arab population, where the desert divided their land between south of Egypt and north of Sudan. It was one of Africa's greatest civilization, actually, and their achievements and existence was based on trade and on crafts. They were trading partners with Egypt in terms of ebony, ivory, skins, and feathers that were manufactured and found in the king's tombs, and especially that of Tutankhamun. So Nubia is a very interesting civilization that actually have gone through problems lately. It was called the Gold Land because it held such an abundance of precious metals and gold, and because its inhabitants produced some of the most crafted, finely crafted jewelry of the ancient world. It was the homeland of kings who were buried in enormous tombs surrounded by many others, and it was really a great civilization. The Nubian community have unique characteristics. It is expressed in their culture, especially their dress, their dances, their tradition, music, as well as their indigenous language that they strive now to keep and to preserve. So what is the problem and why are we studying the Nubians and the Nubian community actually? It's because, I just want to minimize this. It's because by 1960, there was a dam that was constructed at Aswan, southern Egypt. It created a 500-mile long lake, which permanently flooded ancient temples and tombs, as well as hundreds of villages in Nubia. Many Egyptian Nubians were forcibly resettled on the hills after the construction of the dam, which they moved and they left their land, and they were forced to do that. That's why we have a problem statement here in this paper, which is the contemporary Nubian society is facing challenges due to the forced migration that I was just talking about, and due to the effects of modern lifestyle imposed by international tourism and globalization as well. There was an international awareness towards the value and magnitude of the Nubian rich culture, and their dramatic circumstances were raised by UNESCO. And Nubia became one on the list of important and attractive touristic cultural heritage destinations. A flux of tourists from around the world became interested to visit and explore the old civilization and what's left of it. And that's why the relocation issues on one hand and the speed of modernization effects on the other represent the threats that face Nubian community now. So this is the problem that we're tackling now. These points are worth raising intellectual reflections regarding the controversy of accepting evolving traditions in their new homeland and the appreciation of alternative ways of addressing heritage in contemporary Nubian society. The research questions here are regarding the impact of new forms of tourism with the predominance of digital communication, social media, and online interaction in terms of virtual and tradition. They became controversial. How did the Nubian community adapt to the relocation circumstances? Did the Nubian community manage to reconcile the modern and the traditional in everyday life? It's the aim of this paper, to examine the interplay between tradition, nostalgia, and modernity in the search for authenticity in the Nubian community. So what is the impact of new agents of globalization that confront the Nubian traditions and values now? We are focusing here in this research on the cultural impact on Nubian community as a case study, and to discern the ways they develop to overcome the challenges they face. This paper is partially based on a survey conducted by architecture students of the American University in Cairo in spring 2019 on Nubian villages. It's the cultural impact of tourism that refers to the changes that happened in the arts, artifacts, customs, rituals, architecture, and people that we are going to investigate. So we noticed the disconnection between young and old generations. This is the old generation in the picture, and this is partially the new generation. And the attempts of addressing new tools for cultural tourism was investigated through this research. Concerns related to the commodification of authentic traditions are identified. Observations of stage authenticity, where the craftsmen responded to growing demands that suits the expectations of the tourists. The aspects of acculturation and modernization in young Nubian generations are also described. The impact of new agents of globalization that confront tradition, value, everyday life is highlighted and analyzed. So the dichotomy may arise between the image of the self and the expectations of the other. The other is the tourists and the others, which in extreme cases, it creates an image dictated by the aspiration of the others for the different and the exotic at the expense of preserving the self. This dichotomy results in adopting and or inventing new ways of addressing traditions, values, and everyday life rituals. So we're going to see what happened here. The adaptive reuse of traditional meanings, there was actually trials to encourage local community to creatively reinterpret their heritage, thus move beyond the frozen historic signs, frozen history as we call it, and advocating only historic values, but instead they can move towards contemporary applications. When locals are participating in decisions about how to develop and manage cultural heritage attractions, it helps to build community bonds and enhances pride among the residents. In the Nubian society, the social life organization is tribal, each group conceiving of itself as being united by a bond of blood and as having descendants from a common ancestor. The family in old Nubia was the primary agent of socialization, but today, with universal education, young generation acquiring digital and multimedia ways of communication, new means of socialization emerged. The ever-decreasing land availability due to construction of the dam led to the immigration of males to cities seeking state jobs, which created an imbalance in the sex ratio, especially in the middle range age. But this led to increasing involvement in the modern life as well. The Nubian woman normally bears loads of jewelry all over her body, around her neck. She carries 2 lines of necklaces topped with 2 lines of jewelry. A Nubian woman adorns herself with tattoos, normally shaped like a crescent on the forehead and around the lip. The Nubian woman now is known for her remarkable use of jewelry, henna and perfume, which remains as one of the main characteristics of their charm and attractive asset. The adaptive use of traditional settings happened, and it was developed in arts and crafts. The symbolic arts included walls and doors, decoration, like relief decoration was typical of Nubian houses before. Icons of animals were made to protect houses from the evil eye. After resettlement, relief decorations were replaced by painting, where most paintings made by Nubians with vivid colors, and the traditions continued, but with a different form. An adaptive reuse of traditional settings happened. As an example, a village that is called Gharb Sohail refused to leave the river and sought a refuge on some islands near Aswan. This village is one of the few last remaining strongholds of the Nubians. It's a little village that represents the all authentic flavor of the Nubian culture. It offers more than the eye needs. It is a preserved isle expressing one of the oldest civilizations in the world, where Nubians have not only conserved their ancient traditions, but also developed ways to offer its flavor to visitors. These villages provide an opportunity for tourists from across the world to see and experience the rich heritage of the culture of the Nubians. They are hosted by Nubians in their houses to have a meal or a cup of tea, to sip and wander around in their marketplaces. So the stereotyped expected vision of Nubians extends to their homes, where tourists who wish to see traditional Nubian villages seek the authentic way of life in Nubian houses, traditional music, artifacts, dress and family patterns and food. The home may thus become a cultural commodity both for tourists and locals. The current modern real lived Nubian houses now contain TVs, VCRs, internet and ceiling fans within the mud plaster walls and the ceiling, the barrel wall ceilings and mastabas. But this isn't a way of addressing the economic needs of the community, responding to tourists' demands without compromising traditions. So evolving the tradition to maintain the feeling of the authentic setting and reinterpreting it in a modern way. Nubians who moved to Cairo brought their colorful heritage with them and adapted to the modern lifestyle. Others who remained inland developed new ways of addressing their traditions. And their vivid colors and patterns are applied into different types and different products that were sold and arts and crafts. They managed to highlight the rebirth of the ancestral heritage. So with the influx of international cultural tourism into Nubia, new modes of interaction were found, new forms of communication emerged. The acceptance of evolving traditions and the introduction of different ways of addressing heritage in contemporary Nubia society are a way out to ensure the endurance of this timeless culture. Individual initiative included language preservation, arts and crafts development, music, reinterpretation, and dissemination through modern technologies. As a matter of fact, music as a remarkable aspect of the Nubian culture has evolved with modernity. They used new tools, new modes of expanding and enhancing their music. There is a new style of Nubian music has grown. A number of fans outside the Nubian community and the culture have now grown, and it is developing, evolving, and flourishing, as well as the Nubian language as well. Several Nubian associations are currently trying to revive the Nubian language that was disappearing among the younger generation. They created methods to write and disseminate their literature. There are good efforts to document and save the language through blogs, mobile-based applications, and other means, digital means and modern means of preserving their language. Their dream is to create an online platform where all Nubian projects and initiatives to be gathered in one place. So my concluding remarks, just to make things short and abide with the time, I'm trying to be fast as much as I can. My concluding remarks is that it was demonstrated through this study that in spite of the dramatic circumstances of relocation on one hand, and the fact that the global nature of tourism and the accompanying virtual media created challenges for the Nubian community, their tradition survived, where new modes of reinterpreting heritage emerged. Technology is making it ever easier to creatively address heritage landmarks and generate interest and enthusiasm from locals and visitors alike. Smart devices apps allow heritage sites to speak to visitors. They lead people on customized walking tours of cultural destinations and allow endless virtual opportunities for creative interaction with heritage and culture. So it is argued through this study that there could be no dichotomy between the virtual and the tradition, which was the question that was posed at the beginning. There are trials and improvement, development being done. New agents are being invented to transform the very notion of tradition, and new modes of communication are used to reinforce heritage. And that's it. Thank you. I hope I managed to abide with the time and not being too quick. And thank you for listening.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you very much, Nagwa. That was, you're before time, so that was excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
But speaking of Nubian music, I was just thinking of Hamza El-Din, the great Nubian oud player.
Yes.
And, he used to live in Oakland out here, not far away from where I live in Berkeley. And wow, I mean, he's of course passed away now, but I remember listening to him. And still, his album "A Wish" I'd recommend to everybody. I wish we could play it right now, but anyway.
I wish we could. Yes.
And it's called "A Wish."
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so let's go to our next speaker. Thank you very much, Nagwa. And our next speaker is Wenxing Zheng, and her paper is titled "Reinventing Modern Heritage: Changing Landscapes of Former Industrial Areas in Hong Kong." Wenqing Zhang is currently enrolled in the PhD program in the Department of Architecture at the University of Hong Kong. Trained as an architect for a bachelor's degree and an urban designer for a master's degree, Zhang's research interests focus on the sustainable development of arts and cultural industries under inner city gentrification and how it is interrelated to other disciplines, particularly under the context of Hong Kong. So welcome, Wenqing. And once again, her paper is called Reinventing Modern Heritage, Changing Landscapes of Former Industrial Areas in Hong Kong. Thank you.
So, can you hear me clearly and see my PowerPoint?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
I will start my presentation. So, hi, my name is Wenqing, a third-year PhD student in the coming semester. Actually, it starts today in the Hong Kong time. So I'm from the Department of the Landscape Architecture at the University of Hong Kong, and my research, as you have introduced, focuses on the urban development and under the specific site of Hong Kong. And my research intends to use the arts development as a lens to explore the transformation process of Hong Kong from the manufacturing economy to the service-based economy in both architecture and urban form, as well as both economic and social perspectives. So through this researching process, I'm also looking at how previous industrial space were being reused for arts and cultural development, and how this reusage related to the discourse of the heritage conservation. And today I will use two cases as examples to show how different groups of the people have been influenced to the non-use industrial space and help to reshape the new urban landscape of Hong Kong. And the presentation will be around 80 or 90 minutes, but I will try to be as concise as possible. So in the 50s and 60s, Hong Kong went through the process of the industrialization. And in order to solve the spatial pressure come from the booming industrialization, industrial districts with multi-story reflective factories were built. Moreover, housing authority also provide public housing estates near the industrial areas to solve the commuting issue of the workers. Those former industrial areas not only carried many people's working experience in the past, but also closely associated with their everyday living experience. So many children who were born in the 60s and 70s actually grew under such an environment. And later in the 80s and 90s, especially after the open door policy in mainland China, Hong Kong faced the challenge of the deindustrialization. Factories were relocating to the north, and plenty of the industrial space in Hong Kong became vacant. So those vacant industrial space provide a unique opportunity to those artists and art organizations. They converted some of them into the art use, and considering its spatial quality, such as the high floor ceiling, cargo elevators, which is perfect for moving paintings and installations, and also relatively spatial floor area compared to the other buildings types in Hong Kong. And two cases I selected here, the mills in Tsuen Wan and Wang Zhuhan, which is the main part of the South Island Cultural District on the Hong Kong Island. Both sites were major industrial districts before, and today has attracted many artists and art-related industry to settle there. And this timeline shows that gradually the deindustrialization process of Hong Kong and the emergence of the art and cultural development. So the blue one will present the industrial development, and the red one is the arts and cultural development. And around, and also in the background, the darker gray is the GDP for the secondary industry, and the lighter one is actually the total GDP of Hong Kong. So you can see that actually around later that there is a shift that the secondary industry no longer is a leading industry of Hong Kong. And around 2000, there is a turning point, not because of the handover, but also worldwide. Many industrial cities were looking for the solutions to revitalize the once spectacular landscape. one of the widely accepted solutions is the creative city concept that claimed by Richard Florida, Charles Landry, and so on, which encourages the use of the arts and culture as an urban policy instrument and marketing tools to solve urban problems. So the first case I will talk about is the mills. As its name shows, its former usage is a textile mill. As one of the major the textile industry reaches its peak in 1978 when there were 33 cotton mills in Hong Kong. So the founder of these mills, Chen Jinghua, moved to Hong Kong in 1949 from Shanghai, engaged in the cotton yarn and clothes business. In the 54, he invested 600,000 Hong Kong dollars to open the mills in Chuen Wan. And in the 70s, with the emergence of the new technology that increased both the quality and also the speed of the production, and Nanfeng, which is the company owned by Chen, became the leader of the textile industry in Hong Kong. In the 80s, like around 80% of the cotton yarn used by Hong Kong manufacturers actually is provided by Nanfeng. So the mills represents Hong Kong's textile industry histories during the period of the 50s. In the later half of the 70s, Chen also invested in the property development and the stock investment. He bought a lot of land to expand the factories and even develop large private housing projects. So this also marks that Nanfeng became one of the Hong Kong's important property developers. After market reform in mainland, so this industry further declined, and Nanfeng Textile shift focus in 1993 and diversified into the real estate. In 2010, Hong Kong government rolled out a policy make it easier and cheaper for industrial buildings that are at least 15 years old to be converted for non-industrial use. In the 2014, the non-profit Arts and Culture Institution Mill 6 Foundation, run by the property developer Nanfeng Group, is restoring this former cotton mill in Chuen Wan. This initiative is proposed by Chen's granddaughter Vanessa, who had trained in landscape architecture and planning. And this initiative aims to preserve the textile and garment making culture and fostering creativity and new textile arts related to Hong Kong's industrial past at the same time. So they're hoping that the mills can turn the neighborhood into the textile incubation hub and spearhead regeneration. Architecturally, the design keeps most of the original external appearance and reinforces structures with the intention to tell the industrial history that 60, 70 years ago, maybe one of the new space that created is this three-story atrium in the middle, and which provides a space where people want to gather. And there is actually, this is a 3-building compound project with an intention to develop creative and cultural industry. From the diagram, you can see that all potential programs such as the creatives, cultural practitioners, artisans. The pink marked space is called CHAT, which is the abbreviation for Center for Heritage, Arts and the Textile. This is an exhibition and studio space with 3 galleries measuring between 1,000 square feet to the 4,000 square feet. And one will be reserved for the, old machinery and archive material that talks about the textile industry and Chuen Wan's history. It's a long-term exhibition space and will exhibit photos, stories of the former workers and invite those people back either for the old friends gathering or like participating in the workshops with the youngs, sharing their stories to people who didn't experience Hong Kong's industrial development. Those activities also remind the arguments of the conservation that the labor culture is not isolated from the old mechanical plant. It's also attached to the workers and presents a relationship between workers, machines, and the plants. So the space that is actually should be socially constructed, therefore, to preserve the heritage of the space, it's also important to pay attention to the relationship between the space and the people. And through those workshops and the new experience taking place between the former workers in the renovated space, there are new historical layers could be generated through and enriches the meanings of the art space. The other two exhibition space will use for the exhibition of the artwork and the research related to Hong Kong's fashion and textile industries. There is also a studio for an annual residency program, which will host artists from different countries, giving support to further arts and cultural development in Hong Kong. In terms of the architecture conservation, it's a type of a disappearing typology building. Many of former mills have been torn down for new development. Through renovation, it provides a unique form of the art center with exhibition space, artist studio, experiment lab, co-working space that allow individuals visiting to learn and experience art and design. Although considering the mills is a private developer-initiated single project, which has limited influence to the general urban landscape, while in some way it did provide a foundation for another unprecedented institution. And the second one, the different from the mills as a single project by the private developer, Wang Zhuhang is more likely a bottom-up regenerated arts and culture district, which followed a natural evolutionary path in the beginning. So before the 60s, Wang Zhuhang is actually a fisherman center. And through reclamation and industrialization in the 60s, some factories have started to settle down here. During its peak time of the industrialization, more than 40 flagship factories scattered on the South Island side with various kinds of the industries, including rubbers, printing, medicine, and so on. And today, this place have many new buildings being built, such as large residential projects, and financial headquarters have also moved in to supplement the inadequate office space in the central downtown, which will change the new urban landscape in the future. Similar as many cities like Soho in New York, artists catches this opportunity to convert vacant factories into the studio and galleries. Compared to the other space, here is cheaper and bigger and far away from the residential buildings. So artists don't need to worry about disturbing others, especially some arts production requires woodworks and large machines installed. Therefore, a number of the art communities sprang up in those former industrial areas, and Wang Zhuhang is one of them. Those old flat factories have different backgrounds. Some stayed the same due to the fragmented ownership. Some were torn down and redeveloped into the other use. Some were converted with a wave of land transformation fee. However, the later one has to provide certain space to the local artists with below rate market price. As I mentioned before, that Hong Kong also adapted this creative city concept, which is emphasized the important roles of arts and cultural economy. And here I will also discuss the two cases. As I mentioned in the previous case study, in 2010, Hong Kong government announced this industrial building revitalization schemes. Many developers convert those their old factories into the office use. Nanfeng is one of them, and also many developers in Wangzhouhan also did this. Genesis is one of the example here. It was called Good Prospect Industrial Building before, and it was converted by Hip Shin Hang through the renovation of the facade and interiors. Under the support of the government, Hip Shin Hang and Hong Kong Arts Development Council, which is Hong Kong ADC, come to an agreement which Hip Shin Hang leases a floor with below market rate to the emerging artists for 16 years. Arts Development Council will take the responsibility to select the qualified artists. By doing this, Hip Shin Hang receives a discount of the land transformation fee and also gain the reputations. However, the later artist selection process as well as the using experience of this space received many questions and debates. The application process is very strict and complex, with only 17 studios provided. The contract is a 2-year lease, so the artists also have to reapply once the term ended. More importantly, there are various limitations of using those studio space compared to to renting a private reflective factory space here, the artists also feel hands are tied and being strictly managed by the government institutions during their art production. And besides those government-funded art space, there are also art galleries hiding inside of those factories, especially after the 2013. This year, Hong Kong was selected as Art Basel's owning Asian outpost. These international art fairs not only brought the global attention to the city, attracting collectors and galleries from the West, and giving international credibility and exposure to the local artists. Wang Zhuhan is close to the main site of the Art Basel Hong Kong. Take this advantages of the location. There are increasing visitors, art lovers, collectors come to Wang Zhuhan. Many international galleries also choose to open the branch around the same year as Wang Zhuhan. So the different types of the arts were exhibited and performed in the former industrial space, giving the new meaning and new productions to the art space. So Rose is one of them. It's a gallery originally founded in London, but opened a branch in Hong Kong in 2013. Not just focused on the presenting international artists, and they also invited local artists, create art residential programs. This one showing here is actually their last exhibitions in the industrial space. The artist spends 2 months inside of the gallery to create paintings that inspired by the gallery space itself. Unfortunately, this unit were sold to the other developers this year. So Rose has to find an alternative space in the future. This is also one of the challenges that Hong Kong arts and culture industrial faces. The rapid real estate development have pushed those artists further away from the city center due to the reduced industrial space and the increasing prices. So last slide, although the mills and Wang Zhuhan are 2 different scales and started from different occasions, their entirety and spatial classroom has established a cultural mirror in the formerly inaccessible industrial areas and provide new meanings to the space. Their new use of the former industrial space also raised different thinking towards industrial heritage conservation. For example, compared those 3 spaces I have mentioned before, the green one is run by Hong Kong ADC, which is the Genesis. So besides the application process, there are 26 artists have to squeeze into such a limited space. It indirectly sees the misunderstanding of arts production between the artists and the government. One of the reasons to reuse those industrial space is because of the spatial quality, while the ADC art space is full of limitations that cannot fulfill artists' requirements. So how to preserve while make the old space efficiently used is the important thing to think about. And in the middle, you have Rose Gallery in the regular reflective factory, while they also faces the challenges that if the owner sold the space to others, they have to end the business. The new emerging art cluster not only attract artists and gain recognition by the government, but also cause the gentrification of the space. With the new residential and office buildings, artists are stimulus in the beginning, but also become the victims within this urban transformation process. And the third one, the mills, which is a new experiment by some ambitious designers, also raised the critiques and questions. For example, people raise the question of like what government developers want to preserve, whose stories were telling, whose tradition and history were ultimately conserved. Through the renovation of the mills, exhibition and architecture elements of the factory were selectively being preserved in order to narrate this story of industrial development at that period. However, this reinterpretation of the past and using cultural economy as a vision of the urban development, people also argue that is actually a way to reinforce the urban leadership of the government and the real estate developers. So through the redevelopment project, the property developers' positive images were created. Here, we can see Nanfeng and Hepxinghang. That this project those projects is a public city exercise to improve their image rather than a pure conservation project. And especially today, there is a fashion for nostalgia in Hong Kong. Those conservation projects were seen as a symbol of a never say die spirit and the potential for dreams to come true. It reminded us the success story in the past, but how to reuse those modern heritage will be a question need to further investigate. So yeah, and that's all, and thanks for watching. Hope I didn't.
Thank you very much, Wenxing. That was a very interesting paper. Thank you very much. And you were like spot on time, so it's great. Okay, so just moving ahead, let's move on to our next paper. And our next presenter is Manas Murthy, who is an architect, educator, and urban designer with professional experience in sustainable urbanism research, sustainable mobility design, and community engagement. He is currently a PhD student at the University of Oregon, Department of Architecture, conducting an intersectional study of the emergence of a new residential building type and its relationship with informality in Delhi, India. In the past, he has worked with the Prince's Foundation for Building Community in London and coordinated a community engagement-led alternative mobility and accessibility project for a neighborhood street in Delhi. Manas's presentation is titled Breaking and Making Traditions, Disjuncture in Spatial Planning Futurities for Delhi. Welcome, Manas. Over to you.
Hello, thank you so much for that introduction. Hopefully live up to all that. So as I've already been introduced, I'm a PhD candidate at University of Oregon. I'm currently doing my fieldwork in Delhi, which is basically looking at this new residential building type called builder floors in Delhi. And much of this paper sets up the sort of historical planning background or context for my doctoral research. Yeah. So this paper seeks to critically analyze essentially 3 historic spatial planning paradigms for Delhi, from the colonial times to the present moment, and highlight the failure of the state to comprehend the complexities of existing typomorphological patterns, to work in concert with indigenous and informal modes of spatial production, and to enfold the entirety of Delhi's urban fabric within its purview. The failure of these spatial planning projects arguably indicates a fundamental disjuncture between imposed development paradigms and organic growth. Moreover, sometimes unintentionally and other times willfully, these planning models are complicit in the proliferation of informal production, only to then capitalize on its surplus. This results in a vicious cycle of breaking and making planning traditions, as I say, that remain both antagonistic towards and dependent on the informal culture of building. Though the official figures vary approximately from 24 to 50%, there is generally wide consensus that informal unplanned settlements far exceed planned housing in Delhi. Such a vast gap between plan and reality is a phenomenon that extends far back into our history. That is riddled with interventions by colonial officers, emigre architect planners, each attempting to establish sort of new paradigms of urban development that follow traditions established elsewhere. This paper follows a series of such interventions that are models of developmentalism and modernism rhetoric writ large, as I argue. Among recent events that have stirred the debate is the Lutyens Delhi redevelopment proposed by the government in 2019. On the one hand, the need for modernization and upgradation of government buildings has often been coupled with broader concerns around densification and upgradation of New Delhi itself. Several iterations of the Lutyens Bungalow zone, as you can see on the bottom, have sought to revise the boundary of this precinct, offering development exemptions to specific property owners and real estate lobbyists from time to time from its so-called restrictive guidelines. On the other hand, conservation lobby has sought to protect the precinct's heritage value, most notably through its inscription as a World Heritage Site in 2014, which didn't ultimately go through. But basically, though the identity of New Delhi is currently being fiercely fought over, the area itself remains hopelessly out of reach of the average citizen. New Delhi is not where most citizens of the city reside or feel connected to, except perhaps in a sort of abstract sense as a symbol of national identity or an iconic imageable district. However, this disconnect was not solely brought about by New Delhi. It's a series of colonial interventions that precede the great imperial capital also perpetuated this sort of dichotomous reality of Delhi. With the introduction of railways in 1860s, agricultural reforms, changes in the structure of land ownership and taxes, Delhi became a major hub for commerce. The colonial government actively fostered entrepreneurship, and Shah Jahanabad, which is in the shown there in the map, saw rapid densification and growth that expanded out into areas such as Sadar Bazaar, also shown on the map, which is outside the walls. Much of these developments entailed significant land acquisition and of rural and indigenous land. In fact, the very acts of land survey and titling were transformative, making a great impact on pre-existing land occupation and communal stewardship models such as Tayul and Nazul. And though most colonial interventions were typically driven by concerns of securitization, public health, ease of governance, and revenue collection, early 20th century interventions such as Clarkganj turned towards speculative real estate development outside Shahjahanabad. Effectively, I'm saying all interventions by the British eventually contributed to the condemning of Shahjahanabad and its labeling as old city, as in something which is old to be abandoned in favor of the new. New Delhi introduced new kinds of political and administrative hierarchies in its spatial form and land use, and morphological segregation became standard practice after independence. To house the 106% hike in its population after independence in 40 to 50 census, 30% of which comprised of refugees, the state planned and built plotted neighborhoods and group housing societies en masse. These primarily came in the form of Clarence Perry's vision of the ideal neighborhood unit. Firmly rooted in a developmentalist ideal following American urban sociologists' view of urbanism at the time, the ideal neighborhood had carefully segregated land uses, each plot meant to house a single nuclear family, and the neighborhood was designed with schools, community centers, parks, shopping centers. Essentially a new planning type that eventually made its way to India in the 1930s and 40s through emigre architects such as Königsberger, who designed Bhubaneswar, shown here at the bottom left, and Mayer, who did Chandigarh, neighborhoods of Chandigarh. But these models were swiftly institutionalized within the newly fashioned development authorities of cities, as was the case with the interim general plan for Delhi. The new spatial planning paradigm was based on principles of modern urban sociology, secular, democratic, individualistic, where the plan itself was the utopia, the technocratic apparatus. As Ravi Sundaram argues in another paper, the plan's important innovation was to set in motion an implicit idea of the city as a machine, which was regulated by a technocratic apparatus, all regulated by law. So by the 1970s, following all of this, Delhi became a city with low-rise, medium-density residential neighborhoods. Streets within these newly planned neighborhoods were mostly devoid of cars, pavements for that matter even. Children would play on the street, unafraid of passing vehicles. Parents would look on, impromptu conversations with neighbors happened. That's the kind of city I was born in. Eventually, much like colonial planning schemes, the new plan was dependent on acquisition of vast tracts of Delhi's hinterland, including villages, whose residential codes, called Abadi areas, remained exempt from building controls that soon adapted to a new form of organic development, growing vertically and subdividing properties into multiple dwelling units, mix of uses, etc. Once again, outside the purview and control of the plan, organic growth flourished. accommodating new migrants to the city, lower income populations, and the informal economy. And a similar fate came to the plotted neighborhood after liberalization in the 1990s. With the introduction of freehold property rights, enhancement in disposable incomes, and a rise in property values, neighborhoods saw rapid growth and densification. And eventually, neighborhood streets came to be fraught with the conflicts, as I've listed and shown on this image. Neighborhoods that were initially planned for the automobile, yet scarcely had to deal with it, eventually failed to accommodate the unprecedented growth of personal vehicles, even as informal commercial activity on the streets thrived. Parking pressures mounted, and eventually what led to what is called the parking crisis in Delhi. The organic densification and encroachment of street space by cars and commercial activity is for the most part an unintended consequence of the automobile-oriented planning. However, government's response to cope with the demands generated precisely by such planning only made matters worse. Incremental enhancements in ground coverage, in FARs, and notification of residential streets for commercial activity kept bringing more and more cars, essentially. And one of the impacts, as I'll talk about, eventually in 2011, the Municipal Corporation of Delhi issued an administrative order which enforced sort of mandatory inclusion of a stilted parking floor in any kind of residential redevelopment. It was essentially an emergency instrument to deal with the parking crisis that had come along in these neighborhoods. However, it is possible that that's precisely what fostered the emergence of what I'm studying, which is the builder floors. Shown here, transforming buildings, what are on the left to what are seen on the right. The builder floor apartment type is essentially a 4 to 5 story stilted residential building where a builder invests capital in the form of construction costs in return for a share of newly subdivided property. This effectively subdivides the property among multiple owners and converts a single dwelling unit into an apartment building, further increasing demand for parking, sewage, electricity, and other infrastructure. Meanwhile, the discourse around urban transport and evils of automobility had been growing since the 1970s, 80s, leading up to a significant shift in the agenda for urban development, leading up to what is called the transit-oriented development model in India. Based on principles of land use and transport integration, TOD is intended to make public transport more accessible. But more importantly, it is typically planned, TOD is intended to make public transport more accessible to commuters and address the parking crisis in the city through demand management and incentivization of public transport. Typically planned around major public transit corridors, TOD has the potential to leverage significant infrastructure investment and attract capital. Additionally, as a spatial planning model, it incentivizes clean slate development of vast tracts of public land in the heart of the city. The first major pilot project for TOD has been proposed at Karkarduma and shown here in the image. Situated at one of the end terminals of the Delhi Metro, this project is forcefully marketed by the Planning Authority and presents the next major paradigm for urban development. However, recent research reports from a similar comprehensive development project in the city don't bode well for the future of the model. The new project, as I'm describing, breaks sort of TOD norms, greatly underestimated the vehicular traffic it produces, and is suffering from water woes. Despite its location next to a transit hub, the project does not seem to disincentivize car use by residents and has significantly added congestion along the major arterial roads of the city. And essentially, such developments fail to account for the prolific informal housing and rental market in the city, much of which comes from the very urban villages and settlements that formal planning had maligned. Besides, TOD tends to focus infrastructure investment along major arterial roads, further taking attention away from the problems of existing neighborhoods. Finally, I conclude by saying this paper follows 3 major spatial planning paradigms in Delhi's history. Colonial rulers sought to impose modernity through infrastructure and systematic capture of land, in the process eradicating indigenous land practices. Their economic goals fostered commerce and entrepreneurship, in the indigenous populations while condemning the old city for the resultant growth and net densification. New Delhi sought to establish a new ideal for urban planning and kept the urban elite away from burgeoning lower classes. Post-independence planners, unable to deal with the dense and fraught urban fabric of the city, chose once again to direct fresh growth to new planned neighborhood units and embraced its principles of nuclear family dwellings and non-sectarian social order for fear of ghettoization after partition. In the decades that proceeded, neighborhoods burgeoned into congested containers for private vehicles and encroachments. Temporary and incremental solutions by the state only made matters worse. To harness the developmental potential of mass transit, TOD projects have been conceived. However, even TOD might be more focused on revenue generation and investment potential of clean slate redevelopment rather than confronting ways in which informal production has transformed existing neighborhoods. These spatial planning firsts are in many senses the most landmark junctures in Delhi's history, transformative and generative of its most iconic built fabric. However, in order to differentiate themselves, these models must not only malign the informal past, but also act as catalysts in their dereliction, while simultaneously producing and delineating thresholds between formal and informal, order, chaos, planned and unplanned. And yet these models are dependent on informal production that must first be instigated, then marginalized in favor of new, formally planned utopias, resulting in a vicious cycle of breaking and making traditions in spatial planning practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Manas. That was interesting. Really curious about your builder floor apartment type. That sounds pretty interesting. But anyway, thanks for that. Again, perfectly on time, like everyone else. So thanks for that. So we're going to go to our fourth and final presenter for this session. And our final presenter is Mohammad Tantawi, who has worked in the design and planning field at Cairo-based firms before pursuing his master's degree in integrated urbanism and sustainable design. His research focused on the urban sociology, resilience, and self-organization in informal settlements in Helwan, South Cairo. He's also exploring new cultural and geographical perspectives that link the reality in Egypt with the classic theories of human geography. His paper today is titled Modern Flows, Introducing Textscapes of New Vernacular Architecture Practices in Egypt. Welcome, Mohammad.
Yes, welcome to you. Now I'm going to share my screen directly.
Can you also turn up your volume a little bit?
Is it good right now?
Yeah, that's better. Yeah.
I think that's okay. Okay. Hello everyone. Yes. Yes. Now I'm on board. Hello everyone, and thank you for this chance to present my paper. My paper is entitled with Modern Flows, that introducing textscapes of new vernacular architecture practices in Egypt. And I'm Mohammad Tantawi. I'm living in Egypt and working right now as an architect. And I will continue with the paper. Okay, I will start with the paper motive. What brings me here? Actually, I'm not an academic colleague. I'm a practitioner. I came from the site just 2 days ago. I'm working with right now. I'm working in the restoration project of New Gurna village in Luxor. New Gurna village is a well-known village made by a famous architect called Hassan Fathi. So I came from the discipline of restoration of an old village, and while working in this position, I figured out that there is a new phenomena has been arrived into the craftscape or the technical scape of earth construction. So this is what I'm putting my research upon. The paper motive was tracing the transformation of the core values of the textscapes of vernacular architecture. What I mean by this is disappearing the building rituals, and the vanishing of the craft inheritance and the hierarchy of the craft education system or learning system. Other motive, and I will go through this later on, other motive
7 o'clock.
Other motive came across my mind while working this project is the necessity to introduce a core values system to the craftscape of vernacular architecture in Egypt. As I told you, in the past year and a half, I passed across a lot of master crafters or craftsmen who are working in the field of vernacular architecture. Especially in my project, I have witnessed a lot of examples of craftsmen from all over the world. The first case I went through was the original builders of the village who are Alauddin. He was a very old master crafter. He built most of the village with the architect Hassan Fathi that I will show his work later. And afterwards, in the previous restoration projects, I also traced the new generation of craftsmen who are working in the same field of building with earth material. And while our project, I traced two last generations, the last generation, which is the youngest generation, and the previous generation who are still working with their hand, but very old to do all the work with themselves. So also, I think we are a very critical historical point because we are tracing the decay of these people and their work on the ground. So based on this, I came up with some concerns from these situations. First concern was related to modernism, and I'm tracing that most of the people who are working in this field are overwhelmed with modern architecture. And I'm tracing, I have a lot of discussions with these people who are working in this field, that they are already working, discussing themselves or thinking to shift their career and work in the regular stereotype of concrete building instead of working in earth construction. So this was one of the concerns. Other concern is the superficial practices of people who are imagining that we are doing vernacular architecture in Egypt. And we have a lot of examples of architects who are naming themselves that they are doing a new vernacular escape, and it's very superficial, and maybe they are just putting their hand on the physical appearance of these techniques, and they are letting out a lot of values that it must be embodied in these techniques. So what could be the questions that came of this brainstorming is what could be the intangible inner values in these crafts. So I'm proposing these questions for you also. Patience could be, could be an inner value embodied in the craft itself. Representation. What I mean with this, that if the craft itself representing the crafter or not, or he is just doing his work to gain money. Also uniqueness, because it's very common in this kind of work that the crafter is doing his work and he's very proud of it, and he's putting his signature on it, and he feels that he belongs to what he's doing, and what he's doing is very, very unique, and nobody can do the same as he do. And also I'm thinking of inheritance. Does this craftsman have a new generation of crafts people who are or people who are doing the same craft, or the tree will stop in this level? Another question was related to how we can think in 2021, how we can think to put a textscape that can have an embodied inner value to these platforms, what I described. And I'm expecting from this paper to come to only understand if there is an inner pillars of the craft, if there is an inner value in the craft or not, and also propose a delivery, a new up-to-date delivery method to the new generations. The structure of the paper started with non-epistemological approach to just discuss the old techniques or the old ideas in crafts inheritance or crafts education. And then I'm discussing the dichotomy between the outside and the inside, the core and the periphery, or the meaning and the shell. So this dichotomy between the outside and the inside was also an approach in my paper. And then I'm putting a revisualization for the stereotypes that's already settled in the mind of the craftsmen, and introducing a new vernacular examples in Egypt. Okay, this is the first shock I will shock you with. Okay, this is Nefertiti, and this is very common comic or meme in Facebook that people are discussing, that the same people in Egypt who did Nefertiti before in a certain circumstances did this fake model of Nefertiti in 2020 in one of the urban squares in I don't know where, in Egypt or in Cairo, in Alexandria. I don't know exactly where. But what I concluded from this image, not to just make fun of the new fake copy of Nefertiti, but I was shocked of the quality of the work itself. And I think the quality of this work is representing a lot. It's not only representing poor quality in the craft, but also representing poor quality in the taste of the people themselves. Again, what I mean in that when I see this photo, I see my work. This poor quality that happening in the left side of the image is representing a lot of what I am seeing in the site with working with new generations in my field of earth construction. So this is a start, and I can show you some evidence. This is one of the walls that I did a restoration of, and in the right side is the original wall built by Ala ad-Din, who were the builder with Hassan Fathi, the original builder of this village. And this, in the left side, was a restoration phase made by one of the craftsmen who tried to do the same analogy of the same wall. Actually, this space is the same, and this is the outer. In the right side is the outer door, and this is the inner door of the same space. So he tried to do the same morphology of the wall, but as you can trace with your bare eyes, that there is a huge gap between the quality between the right side and the left side. So living in these circumstances for 1.5 years until now gave me a lot of insights of the crafts in Egypt and what can be applied in this field, and how we need to think of this field with a very, very creative way. Okay, the modern flows. I brought this idea of flows from Arjun Abu Durai, who are an anthropologist. I think he was in Berkeley before, and I think right now he's in London, also professor in London, in England. Arjun Abu Durai has the idea of scales and the flows, and he deal with modernism as an agent who are changing the reality. So modernism is not a passive impact, doesn't have a passive impact on the ground. No, modernism has an influence into our daily habits and daily skills and everything. So what here we can trace an impact of modernism on verticality and the skills. I brought three examples just to be discussed. Calligraphy. In the past, calligraphy was by hand, and there was no typing machines. So every letter was representing the one who are doing the craft or doing this calligraphy. And right now we have the usual machines who are doing the same work for us. Also in building, in earth building, we have
Mohammed, we couldn't hear you, so could you just check your audio?
I think I was,
Okay, we can hear you now.
sorry. I will share again. Right now I'm good.
Yeah, good.
Okay, and the third case was a woodcraft, who are also representing the details of the classic wood, industry in the 19th, and the modern flat boxes that we are dealing with, like IKEA, for example, in this era. So what I mean right there, right here, that modernism has an impact into the skills itself, and has its own production of the mass production, and have its own mixed styles, because one of the impacts that modernism do in verticality is losing the style. You don't know who you are belonging to. Also, I think modernism has its own impact into education, and here I will focus into a historic education system came up from where I came from Egypt, which was an Islamic country in the past decades. So in the past Islamic tradition in learning, we have the idea of the craft master, who are not only a craft. Sheikh al-Tariqa is not only a person who are teaching the craft. No, he's teaching the craft and the discipline. What could be the ideas that he are sharing with his students? For example, morals, accuracy, precision, identity, and being multidisciplinary. These ideas were lost in the modern education system. I think no one, or maybe someone in the room, will argue if these items will be discussed in modern education systems, morals, for example, and accuracy and precision and identity, in the way that the craft master in the past years did. I know that some of these topics are cross-cutting a lot of anthropologists and sociologists discussion, but I mean that everyone who are teaching anything, he put this inside his discipline. So this was something we lost from modernism. What was the tasks of this craft master? First, he is teaching the craft, and he's teaching the inner core values of this craft. And each craft, as I found in some literature, has its own core values. And I will give you example of the core values of architecture from an Islamic point of view, because it's my case study. Also, he's setting the morals of how we buy and how we sell and the standards of the craft. What I mean with the standards, the quality of the craft, and also is setting the price, not to make his craft accessible to all the social classes. The craft master in each craft, in this case, was setting a price for his product or service. Beside this, the craft master was very important to chain with the communication and negotiation with the government, because sometimes we don't have the perfect government composition, and the craft master do this negotiation instead of the crafts members who are do the work with himself. So he was the chain between the crafts member and the government in the communication and negotiation. Also, which is very, very important role for the craft master, was authorizing and firing the craft members. What I mean that in this idea that the craft master has the role of hiring new members in his craft, and anyone who are not doing the work with the proper way, he can fire it. So he has this role, and this role he didn't get it by luck. There is a big hierarchy, starting from being just a labor in the site, and then you are promoted to be something. There is names for this, Arabic names. I don't know. I can't do translation for it. But until you be a craft master, I think you need to work in this craft for 40 or 50 years. So he has the models, and he has the credibility from his members to be in this position. Losing this craft master brought us to this reality, which is a mess, a meaningless craft in Egypt. Also, what I found, it's very with a very, very poor quality, and it's ego-centered in the same thing. With ego-centered, that the craftsman is doing his work just to show off that he's better than others, not to improve or innovate in this craft. Am I heard? Because my internet was lagging.
You're good. We can see you. Yeah. You've
Yeah.
about 2 minutes more. Yeah.
Okay, I will finish very soon. Okay. So this was a checklist to just to propose the craft's inner values. Maybe we can propose inner values in architecture or neo vernacular right now by proposing the idea of the purpose of the building, why you are building this building for. And maybe also we need to promote this the idea of innovation, and also the idea of sustainability is very, very important, especially in earth construction, because as very known that earth construction is very aligned with sustainable ideas, and also connecting with your own heritage as a craftsman. But we will face a misconceptions, and we need to solve each case of these misconceptions. For example, in the case of earth construction, most of the craftsmen replied on me that this craft is very outdated, and the buildings doesn't have the ability to have more than 2 stores, and it's not durable, and it's expensive and not profitable. And you must have these replies and optimization to revisualize or reintroduce vernacular architecture to your own craftsmen. In the case of Egypt, we have this happened before in the Hassan, the one who I'm doing restoration for his village. Hassan Fathy started his village in 1862, in 1940s. And from 1940s until 1990s, Hassan Fathy did a big paradigm shift in rural studies and vernacular architecture in Egypt. And afterwards, the open economy agenda started to change all of this. I will show you some of his work just to be introduced to the guy. This is Hassan Fathi, and he did a village in Luxor, and this village was he made it by mud bricks, the same technique that the people was building in this time. This is some of his designs. And also he didn't only restore the buildings, or he didn't only build this village, he restored the old techniques, the ancient techniques in Nubia, and he reintroduced the catenary vault to the architects to be familiar in this time. Also, there was a lot of discussions about if he putting women in his force, but from what I heard, that one who did the mud bricks was woman, wasn't the men, was the woman in the beginning of the project, and then he changed this. And this reminds me also what happens in Nubia and in Africa, because in these cases, woman is part of the segregated or separated from it. A lot of changes happened to his village until I faced this restoration project, and I saw the craftsmen with these themselves and their identity, and I was thinking if new vernacular examples in Egypt will solve this problem. What I mean in this part, that I think that architects like Adil Fahmi in Fayoum and Ziad in Ismailia, and here we have other examples in Saint Catherine who are building also with earth construction, Ahmed Abdi Gawad and Mariam, and other examples, could be a start to revisualize vernacular architecture in to revisualize a vernacular architecture for the interested craftsmen, and also putting new techniques of putting a new techniques in a calculation of earth impact, and new techniques in building with vernacular materials. So this is the last slide, which is also a brainstorming. So I started with the brainstorming, and I will end with the brainstorming. If the end of tradition is starting with the end of the craft masters, and who can take the role of the craft masters instead, if all the craftsmen is not available, and if technology can help in revisualizing the new vernacular and creating an international network to exchange these experiences. And then I think we need to start to have a comprehensive mapping of the intangible heritage of these crafts. So this is it from my side, and thank you for watching.
Thank you, Mohammed. That was very interesting. Some really, really interesting slides at the end there. All right, so are we going to see all the presenters here?
Yes, I'm working on that.
Okay, great, thanks. So while everybody sort of comes forward, so to say, just maybe, of course, we'll open it up for questions. I'm sure some of the presenters have questions for the other presenters as well. And I mean, from my side, I'm just trying to think of different ways that we can tie this whole discussion together, or come up with some sort of themes that maybe we can all reflect on. And in the first two, I mean, one of the things is it's about transforming places, and the sort of general theme for this session. And we saw with Professor Sharif's paper in the beginning of how, and so the sort of first two papers, at least with Wenxing and Professor Sharif, were about despite the sort of changes that are occurring, certain traditions are continuing, thriving to an extent in Nubia. In Hong Kong, there's a kind of as the industrial landscapes are transforming, there's a emergence of art practices. And Wenxing, you mentioned that this also has some parallels with what we've seen in other parts of the world. I think you mentioned Soho, for example. So that's interesting how these changes are occurring. In Manas, your paper, I think you pointed out how previous models of development were completely being erased, pushed aside, and new models were coming up. Among them being the builder floor apartment type, which you sort of bring up, and so maybe you can reflect on that a little more. And then Muhammad, of course, in your paper was. I think you do mention that there is a loss of craft, there's a loss of aesthetics, there's a loss that has occurred over the last 40 or 50 years. And I think you're really making an effort to articulate how some of that quality and craft that has been lost over decades can be reclaimed in some ways. So yeah, I mean, this is just sort of summarizing some of the things I heard. And I was wondering if, maybe I could open it up to Professor Sharif and just ask a few questions, maybe about the role of the state, the state itself. How has it kind of played a role in the transformation of Nubian culture? Because the Aswan Dam was built in the 60s, if I'm not mistaken. And so, there was a relocation of the settlements of lost villages were resettled on the hills along the Nile River, as you mentioned. But there's also cultural erosion that occurred. And then there's this slow and gradual remaking of that. But did the state have a role in that? Or did the agency for all this come purely from the Nubian people? Were there any external forces at work as well?
That's a good question. Thank you very much. The state as the state just made the effort of building new villages for the relocation, but disregarding all the essence of the old villages. The old villages were all around the Nile. They were very connected to the Nile. The new ones obviously were uphill. So the role of the state was a very formal, rigid one. They did not really take in consideration the culture, the feelings, and the traditions of the people, the heritage, and so on. What I was just mentioning in my research and what I just observed, it's just the effort of the people themselves. I didn't see any governmental effort to reconcile or to help or to do anything on the formal level, except that recently they just allowed representatives from Nubia to be present in the parliament. That's the only official thing that they were striving for, and they obtained it. But your question is really valid. I feel that there is nothing done officially by the government to overcome all these circumstances that were really hard for those people. They did it themselves. They adapted. They tried to survive. They tried to keep their traditions. Some of them are still bitter about their situation, but the new generation is looking forward, and they're not looking backwards again, because they know there is no hope to get back again to what they were, and they were just making use of the new technologies that is available now, and so on. So I really find this very positive, and I praise them for that. So to look forward and not just to cry out for what has happened and what they lost.
And so maybe it's a kind of a blessing that the state didn't intervene in a sense. That,
Yes, you're right. You may be right.
yeah. Yeah, and so Wenxing, I don't know, would you like to just reflect a little bit? I mean, the one thing that I was wondering is a lot of the changes that you described were sort of internal, right? These buildings that are changing from the inside and becoming art galleries, for example, old industrial buildings. Was there any kind of neighborhood level change that was also occurring of the transformation of these industrial landscapes?
I think Hong Kong is currently its experience is urban fabric changing. Right now, from my description, maybe mostly obviously one is the inside usage change, but actually because as I mentioned in the end, that those gentrification that brought up to the Wangzhuhang, actually many buildings were torn down. And also, maybe I didn't mention, I mentioned in the 2010 that the government have this industrial building revitalization scheme, but then there are actually two phases. So like in 2018, they also published the second one, the scheme 2.0, but within this one, actually, there are slightly change of the discount of the urban transformation, the land clearing. So like actually right now, from that policy, you can sense that government actually is more willing the real estate developers to redevelop the buildings instead of converted the buildings, because actually they found it's actually maybe more profitable because they can build a higher floor area ratio and they can get more profit. And also like there are along it, there are strategic plans that they have targets one of the industrial district to be the next CBD to supplement the central downtown. So like there are, from my understanding, like there are many complexes, powers, and also different visions that Hong Kong the government try to develop or change the urban landscapes. But yeah, it also depends on the different sites.
And so this is, I mean, just kind of reflecting on something that occurred in New York in the 1970s and 80s when they had all these buildings which were dedicated to manufacturing, and as manufacturing moved out, artists moved into these buildings, and they were shells because the people who owned the buildings said, okay, we're not going to provide you with heating or air conditioning or anything of that sort. Just take it. And artists took it because they were inexpensive kinds of spaces. And then gradually the artists came and they turned them into lofts, and then loft living became a huge phenomenon, and developers moved in, and then they sort of took over these spaces and selling them at a higher price. And so you see how like culture and capital both kind of become intertwined in urban change. And then there's a great book about that by Sharon Zukin. She's written about loft living. But so there's a similar kind of thing going on in Hong Kong then, right? I mean, now that they're seeing developers and others who are moving in.
But also I feel like there are also different, because Hong Kong is the urban development is quite unique considering its colonial background, that actually before the handover that all the land of Hong Kong is actually crown land. So, and also there is a tradition of the big families, the real estate developers, they have not only the right, the power of the urban development, but because of the land, like the land profit is one of the biggest income GDP of Hong Kong government. So like they also kind of have the power of like not economically but also politically. So I feel like this complexity that is very different from what you said in New York or like in London.
Yeah, thank you. And then we have a question from the audience, Mais.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, thank you all for the great presentations. I have a question to Wingson, and it was indeed interesting to know all these examples and to what direction the development of post-industrial buildings is going. I have a question regarding the examples you presented and what you think about this matter. So most of the projects you presented, they're developed into art and cultural uses. And on the other hand, industrialization and post-industrial or industrial areas are known for the environmental degradation they caused in the past. And for example, in Europe, most like development is naturally directed toward environmentally friendly development and nature-based uses of these places. And what about the situation in China? Is these the examples exclusive what you presented are these kind of uses, or are there other projects of post-industrial development about reuse of these spaces for green, for nature, for example, whether it's vertical gardens or green walls? What about this environmental aspect of development, these post-industrial areas?
I think actually I'm not sure about the mainland, but like in Hong Kong, there are also urban farms that in related to like very small scale urban farm happen in the industrial district. But like generally, because Hong Kong has very limited ratio of the portion of the agriculture, so on. So like those kind of urban farm is also kind of related to the creative industry. But like I think I don't know, like the phenomenon of using the arts, the creative industry inside of the industrial buildings. It's quite I think it's quite interesting in Hong Kong. But I also noticed that the reuse of the buildings for arts and cultural industries in Singapore, they actually reuse mostly is primary schools or like those civic buildings. So I found it kind of interesting that how Hong Kong use those in flagship factories, but actually Singapore also have those flagship factories, but instead of using them, they actually use the civic institutions for the arts or artist studios. Yeah, but I don't know if I answer your questions.
In part of it, thank you. I have another question since you're answering my questions. If I'm allowed to ask another question.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. So transformation in your case or in the Chinese city, is it a spatial process or there is a social transformation happening parallel to this the spatial transformation you have? What about the people's mentality and their appreciation of their industrial heritage? What's their attitude about this and perception?
I think definitely in the social perspectives, there are changes, but there's also I think it's still ongoing, because also like right now, Hong Kong is experiencing this security law, like people will start to rethinking about those kind of freedom of the art productions again. So like there might be the new things coming out, but yeah, definitely I think through the time this arts development will socially change, and also I think this need to be to be expanded in terms of different kind of arts development. So like if you look at the distribution of the fundings to the Hong Kong's arts development, most of them were given to the performing art, and but like for the visual arts, they probably spend less, because the performing arts require larger spaces, like the larger space. But like for the visual arts, they probably thinking about mostly like exhibition space or galleries. But like from the distribution and charts, you can see that only a small portion of the fundings annually they were distributed to the visual arts. So I think also depends on what kind of arts it is, and also there are literacy arts, so like they will be discussed separately, I think.
Thank you. So, Nizar, do you want to go, or should I ask another question, or do you want to wait?
No, go ahead and ask another question. There's still ample time. You have another 20 minutes or so.
Okay, great. Now, I was just going to ask Manas about, the sort of phases of urban change that you identified, the colonial, the neighborhood unit, and how these were, sort of introduced, erased, but they also erased patterns from before, which they did not heed patterns from before when they implemented these new kinds of urban forms. Where does the apartment type that you're talking about, the builder floor apartment type, fit in? And are you suggesting in a way also that that's a form that evolved but hasn't been fully realized, and they've gone to the TOD model? You see what I mean, right?
Yeah, I think partly what I'm trying to say is that these distinctions are not as clear as they might have seemed in my paper. That I want to clarify, because everything leaves a trace, and that's the whole point when I say that's precisely the way in which I say making and breaking traditions of spatial planning. So tradition is always blurry, right? Things get added, things get subtracted, things evolve, things change. So in many ways, these planning firsts at their time were new, but eventually take root. They have lasting impact. They're generative of iconic urban fabric. They have remnants that continue, that persist. But at the same time, at the juncture, at the point where any new is introduced, it has to follow a certain process. Part of that process is to first instigate the proliferation of the informal. It needs the organic to grow out of control, such that it might be maligned and it might be denied, and justifications might be given in order for something new to be introduced. And at the same time, that the introduction of the new is the establishment of a new tradition, or that's the hope. With the plan, with the neighborhood unit, each of these were already projected traditions that were supposed to take root in the future. And so what I'm saying about the builder floor is that it's somewhere in between. It's obviously taken form from something which is a tradition, which is still part of the neighborhood unit. It's still part of that urban form. It's still morphologically contingent upon the rules of a neighborhood planning model, but it does what organic development and informal development does, which is do its own thing. It changes, it transforms, it makes something completely new out of what was something new earlier, but now tradition. And so I think in many ways what I'm saying is that it is both a product. Everything in the informal is also a product of some kind of break or juncture at some point which got started, a new branch, but then informal production makes something all of its own from it. And so the TOD thing is a way to, and that part of it is specifically looking at how mobility, sustainable mobility specifically in public transport and private vehicles, have this kind of battle going on in Delhi. And TOD is both a way to kind of turn a blind eye, was what I'm saying, to the neighborhoods and their actual plight and the actual concerns of private vehicle parking and all of that. But at the same time, under the auspices of trying to foster public transport use or build on sustainable development goals and things like that. So it says that, but what it's actually and actively doing is it's diverting attention from what is fundamentally a private vehicle problem now in Delhi.
Great, yeah, thank you. So Nizar, I heard you were going to play us some music of Hamza Al-Din. We were just talking about that earlier.
Yes.
And said,
I will do that indeed as a way of ending the session. But before that, I actually wanted to ask another question of all four speakers. I very much enjoyed the session, and I recognize that the four papers are very different in terms of scope and scale, in terms of what they really deal with. But one thing that really struck me, and I only want like a 1-minute response from each of the speakers to that, is that you're all, in a sense, still, I don't want to use the term stuck, but in a sense, there is a great deal of nostalgia in how you constructed your material. And that's definitely understandable. I mean, we talk about the Nubians. There's no way that Nagwa can talk about the Nubians without that nostalgia. And it appears to me that one of the things that your session raises is what is the connection between tradition and nostalgia? Are all traditions nostalgically based? Are all traditions that require us to free ourselves from this nostalgia? And I say that because the way I see it is all of your 4 papers have a small escapist aspect to it. In Nagwa's case, it's basically an escape to the present. Let's focus on the present because the present gives us the possibility of a good future, and the younger generation is doing that. In Wei Chin's case, it's almost an escape into policy. In Manas's case, it's almost an escape into theory. And finally, I think in Muhammad's case, it's an attempt to revive craft and escape into craft. So I just wanted to sort of see if my reading is right, and if it's wrong, tell me why it's wrong. We can start with Nagwa.
Well, Nizar, you are right about the Nubians, and yeah, I agree with you that first of all, it's a very big question. Is nostalgia actually tradition and linked to tradition or not? Are we sometimes faking tradition because we're attached to nostalgia and history and so on? You're right about that. And you are also right about, very right about escaping reality from the young generations and aspiring for getting to be acknowledged with the modern world, using new technologies and everything, while still holding on to the nostalgia and the tradition and the heritage and so on. So I completely agree with you. It's a very big question. It's not easy to answer, of course, and it's a debatable question. And the way you see it, I agree with your vision, because it's somehow, this is how it looks, this is how it appears, and this is how it's going to. So thank you for your comment and your vision towards that.
Thank you. Wei Chin?
So for me, I think on the one side, I agree that actually those industrial landscape has nostalgia thing to do with the residents in the past. But on the other hand, I also feel like that those new cultural heritage that the government, like the culturally development, try to recall the past of the Hong Kong is a little bit like selectively narrate this story. So like this nostalgia, it's what like the government or the developers try to create. So it's a very, I don't know if the bias space. So like actually maybe that is not the full the full story of the whole past. So I think I have kind of like 2 takes of that.
Excellent. Manas?
Well, escape into theory, I don't know. Well, part of it is that this is, for me, it is genuinely like a broad survey paper in which I'm looking at many things from the past. So in that sense, yes, it is very much a theory thing. But I think one example of what I mean by tradition here is to say, there are scores and scores of planners that have flourished from the 60s and the 70s that teach students of planning how to draw the layout plan of a plotted neighborhood. Now, that is, what is it? Is it modernism? Is it tradition? Is it not tradition? Is it not a form of craft apprenticeship where students of planning are learning how to draw a layout plan without necessarily knowing what the American sociologists thought about non-sectarian living or what were the fears of ghettoization after partition? So they don't need to appreciate, they're following by rote learning very much through a craft tradition of learning that would happen in any other discipline. So I'm saying tradition is pretty much happening and being broken down all the time. But there is at each of these points, there has been active complicitness in the proliferation of the informal and the proliferation of things that are so-called old, and the labeling of things. So what it does, what the labeling of tradition does, is what I'm more interested in rather than the label itself.
Excellent. Mohammed, do you have anything to contribute to this?
Yes, I'm just want to share that yes, it's a bit nostalgic to search into the crafts, but the crafts is something that came from the roots of the daily habits of these people, of the people in general, of the communities, and participating in international association to study traditional communities or traditional environments is part of being nostalgic as well. So, and I don't know how we can build on an environmental traditional environmental studies without study the history of how these environments layer after layer built upon. So you can answer me how we study this without being nostalgic.
No, no, I can. In fact,
I need to learn. I need to learn.
No, no, no. I fully understand that. I will
Yeah,
actually engage with you because I think this is something that you know, many members of the association over 3 decades have engaged with. The majority of the members of this association today, particularly those who've been involved with us for a while, you know, people like Tano, for example, would tell you that we no longer define tradition as a static legacy of the past, and not even necessarily or simply as a living practice, although part of it, in fact, is that. We look at it as a dynamic and ever-changing project that is often employed and used for political purposes, often by those in power and often by those who resist the exercise of power itself. I very much liked Manas's answer when he sort of operationalized this, because he basically came back and he told us, I'm interested in how this is invoked and used. It's not necessarily what it is. So like you, I actually I'm often nostalgic about the crafts, but I also recognize that some of what used to be produced through craft, through traditional handcraft, is now available mechanically and sometimes but better quality. What does this do? What does this mean? Is in a sense another story. Tano, I know we don't have that much time, but whenever you want to end the session, I will indeed play for you those 90 seconds. It's actually more, it's 3 minutes of something that Hamza Din did, and it goes back to the paper that we started with of Nagwa about the Nubians. Hamza was a Nubian who actually left Egypt in the early 70s, went to Japan, became a citizen of Japan, being an Egyptian Nubian, ended up living in Oakland, California, for the last 15 years of his life. He was a very good friend of mine. He actually did the music for a public television documentary that I did for American public television in the mid 90s called Virtual Cairo. And I used this very specific piece, which in fact was the call for prayers, but made into a piece of music on the road. It captures for me what actually the Nubia of Hamza, not the real Nubia, but the Nubia of Hamza being this international, multicultural individual is like.
And what just to add to that, I play his music every time I do my history of architecture survey lecture on Egyptian architecture. It's like
really?
Always start with Hamza, and the students love it. I mean, and in the last 18 months, we've been teaching virtually. That's been beautiful. Anyway, thanks, Nizar. Yeah.
So
you want to go ahead?
Okay.
Yeah, let's do
it.
So I don't know if you guys would listen to it or if I need to share my screen. I have to ask Lindsay or someone who's following us. Hisham?
No, you can just play it, and your microphone should pick it up.
Okay, if my microphone would pick it up, that would be excellent.
Yeah.
That's it.
Beautiful, beautiful. What a way to end the session at IST with the music of Hamza Eldin. It couldn't be better. Really, truly, that's fantastic. Thank you,
Okay,
Nizar.
you're
That was
back.
great. Thank you.
I'm unmuted now.
Yeah, what were you going to say? Anyway, thank you. That was fantastic. We're almost at 11, and so we have to sign off and say thank you very much to all our presenters. Thank you for all the questions. This was really wonderful, and to end with this beautiful music. So have a great rest of the conference, and hope to see you in some of the sessions. So take care, everybody.
Let
Thank
me
you,
just
everybody.
add.